guys that got left off that list. We're calling them snubs because that's what they're called. Vince Carter, Dwight Howard. Take a look at this list. Vince Carter, Dwight Howard, Kyrie, Tracy McGrady, Tony Parker, just to name a few of the folks not selected as your top 75. Klay Thompson, another notable snub, posted this on his IG. Maybe I'm just naive in my ability to play basketball, but in my head, I'm top 75 all time. All right, Nick, I'll start with you. Who was the biggest snub from the NBA's 75th anniversary team?
Well, I know what you guys are expecting to hear from me today, a dissertation on how we need to respect one of the greatest defensive players and one of the greatest offensive players of the 1980s, Sidney Moncrief and Bernard King. So let me tell you about the 1984 Eastern Conference Final. Okay, that's not what you're here for. They should have made the list, though. But of the modern guys, Dwight Howard not being on here is an embarrassment. And it makes it feel like it's the popular kids table at lunch in high school and not the collection of the 75, make it 76 greatest players in NBA history. There is flatly and conclusively no argument against Dwight Howard to being on this, not being on this list. There are 27 people in the history of the NBA that have 5 or more first-team All-NBAs. Dwight's one of them. There are 30 people in the history of the NBA that have 4 or more top 5 MVP finishes. Dwight's one of them. There are less than a handful of guys in NBA history with multiple Defensive Player of the Year awards. Dwight's got 3 of them. It is an embarrassment that he's not on this list. And if you just want to look at All-Stars, All-NBAs, and top 5 MVPs, Dwight versus guys who made it. You can say, like, you want to make the argument that Carmelo, for instance, has a stronger career resume than Dwight. Okay, I guess. Paul Pierce, he has the Finals MVP, sure. But Reggie Miller is on this list and Dwight isn't? Reggie Miller, not only was he never top 5 MVP candidate, he was never top 1 basketball player in his own family. Reggie Miller, get out of here. Stop it. The idea that Dwight Howard Broussard doesn't make the list because people don't like him and because Shaquille O'Neal has made fun of him on television for a decade really indicts the list. He was the best player on a finalist. He was one of the 5 best players in the league for 5 years, and he was the best defensive player of a mini era. That has to get you on the list, especially when you look at some of the other names that made the list.
I do agree with you, Nick, that Dwight is the biggest snub. I could talk about Vince Carter. I could talk about Tony Parker. But Dwight Howard is the biggest snub. And the thing is this. Now, the committee should know better than this. I understand the casual fans forgetting just how good and dominant Dwight Howard was because he had an 8-year run where he was a top 10 player in the league and 5 or 6 years where he was a top 5 player in the league. He was the anchor on a team that got to the finals with no other stars. Not no other superstars, no other stars. And oh, by the way, they beat LeBron James in the playoffs, right? And they got to the finals. So people forget, though, because Dwight, after his injury in Houston, and that's one of the things that derailed him was an injury, he's had a whole entire second career, like just as long as his first part of his career, where he's been mediocre. And so a lot of people see that. Plus, and I hate to say this, he's been viewed as a goofball. He's starting to rehabilitate that image over the last couple years in L.A., but he's been viewed as that. And so there is some credence to your point of it being somewhat of a popularity contest. Now, I can also look, and I'm glad they kept the top 50 players from the original list in 1997, first 50 years of the league on the list. Didn't take any of them off. But if we were judging a lot of those guys, and I'm not talking about the eye test, because I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about we judge them by a lot of the same things we judge today's players by. How much did they win? How much did they win as the number one guy? How long was their period of greatness? You'd have about a dozen guys on the top 50 original list that would be off. All right, and then a guy like Dwight would be on. Now, whenever you say, well, he should be on, then there's always, well, who you taking off? All right, you mentioned a few guys. I'm going to mention another one, and he's a great player, Dennis Rodman, though. Tremendous rebounder, slightly better than Dwight in rebounding. Great defender, so was Dwight. And Dwight was light years ahead of Dennis Rodman on the offensive end. And again, Dwight was an anchor on the finals team. Rodman was a spectacular role player. So I'm not saying Rodman can't be on there, but he shouldn't have been on there above Dwight. And then I'm going to throw a new guy, a modern guy at you, Nick and Wilds, Anthony Davis. And I get it. If Anthony Davis's career continues to trend upward, and he maybe wins another championship or two, and he maybe puts himself in the MVP conversation like we kind of expect, then yeah, he's over Dwight. But to this point, no. Anthony Davis spent 7 years as the man in New Orleans and made it to the playoffs twice.
Great take.
Won one playoff series. I told you about Dwight, anchor, finals team. So they both won rings with LeBron. All right? Dwight was on that team. I know Anthony was a star and Dwight was a role player, but I'm just saying at this point, if Davis' career ended today, Dwight should be above Anthony Davis.
Ooh.
I thought you were going to, let me ask you a quick question, Broussard, because I thought you were going to say someone else. Because, again, we're not taking older guys off the list because if we are Dwight versus Robert Parrish, like, you got to be kidding me. But set that aside. When you said a modern guy, what's the case if time stopped today for Dame over Dwight? What's the case? Because I can't make it. And I love Dame. I love it. But if we are basing it on what they've done to now, Dame made the list. I have a gut feeling Dame was the tie. I don't know who he tied with, but I feel like he was the guy that tied with someone, which is why we have 76, not 75. But can you think of a credible case for Dame over Dwight? Because I can't.
Not so much a case, but maybe an explanation. Reggie Miller, you pretty much land-based Reggie Miller. Reggie Miller was a great player. And we're going to get into some other guards that didn't make it. Reggie Miller, remember, and some of the guys we're going to talk about in a minute, Reggie was the number one guy. And they got to a finals, played Michael Jordan to 7 games, beat Patrick Ewing. And here's the thing to answer your question about Lillard, Nick. And not that this should count, but an explanation. Clutch. Reggie Miller, I believe, it may be solely on this list for his clutch performances. He became iconic in Madison Square Garden with Spike Lee going at it. All right, Damian Lillard is iconic because he's clutch. Right? All these clutch shots. Obviously, Dwight doesn't have those moments. Now, I'm not saying that should be the tipping point, but I think that's an explanation, Wilds.
No, so I buy that. I think the problem with Dwight Broussard is the fact that his iconic moments aren't in games. I would say that his 2 most iconic moments, maybe 3, is Kobe calling him soft, winning the slam dunk contest with a cape on, which I don't think helps your case, and having the most cringeworthy, disingenuous press conference with Stan Van Gundy and his Pepsi that we've ever seen before. So I think this is the moment that he falls off the top 75 list. And people like Shaq and Kobe and other people never rallied for Dwight. If anything, they pushed Dwight aside. Now, on the flip side, we're seeing the exact opposite with Kyrie Broussard. People are riding hard for Kyrie, Andre Iguodala, and Kevin Durant, because Kyrie's sort of like the player's player. If you play, you think Kyrie's game. I'll also go to say this. If you're in the media, you think Kyrie's game is up here. But if you're an elite-level basketball player, you think Kyrie's game is up here. You think there's something else happening, that players recognize something that the average Joe, the average fan, not necessarily Kevin Durant's calling people casual, but I think it's actually something at the elite tip top of the mountaintop of the sport that you can recognize something in Kyrie that perhaps everybody else can't. So do you have an issue with Kyrie being off the list, Broussard?
Well, first of all, I have an issue with Kevin Durant and Andre Iguodala saying he's a top 20 player ever. All right, that's ridiculous. And I get what